Hi everyone, and welcome to week 4 of our course on minority rights. As usual, here are our learning objectives. Reading 1 is an excerpt from a recent book by the late American historian Eric Weitz, who provides a world history viewed from the angle of human rights. As with many of our works thus far, the key themes here include the complexities of human rights, the mix of inclusions and exclusions that mark any advance, the progress and disasters that are entwined together, and the various meanings of human rights as they have evolved over the modern period. Likewise, this book highlights the nation-state as both the protector and the supreme violator of human rights. Chapter 5 explores this paradox through the lens of the Armenians and Jews, two classic examples of the so-called minority problem that tragically ended in genocide. Both were victims of a larger historical process from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century in which large, multi-ethnic dynastic empires, specifically the Ottoman, Russian, and Habsburg empires, as they were shattered into smaller, ethnic-based nation-states. Although extreme, such cases show just how much is at stake with the question of who qualifies as a rights-bearing citizen and who doesn't. So stay focused on this big question, and don't get bogged down following all the historical details in this longer reading. Reading 2 is by American-based British historian Mark Matsauer, who specializes in modern Greece, 20th century Europe, and international history. This shorter reading covers the idea of protecting minorities by law, but only in the new nation-states that were formed out of the sudden collapse of the great empires of Central and Eastern Europe as a result of World War I. It stresses the tensions at the Paris Peace Conference between the rights to self-determination for these new nation-states and the minority rights for certain segments of their populations. Now, this included not only Jews, but also ethnic Germans. Indeed, by the end of the article, we see how minority rights became a pretext for the spread of fascism. Reading 3 is by Patrick Thornberry, a British scholar who has published widely in public international law and human rights, specializing in the rights of minorities and indigenous peoples and racial discrimination. Now, this reading starts with a bit more historical context, going back to centuries of precedents for international legal protections for minorities, before then covering the minorities treaties that were supervised by the League of Nations post-World War I. As with Reading 2, Reading 3 also covers the failure of the League system. Accordingly, you should either read one or the other. Now, Reading 3 is a bit longer. In fact, it goes on to trace the limited history of minority rights post-World War II, so choose this one if you want more historical context. Finally, Reading 4 is yet another selection from Patrick Macklem's book that we read from last week, in which argues that the purpose of international human rights law is to mitigate the adverse effects of how international law deploys sovereignty. Our chapter this week details how minority rights mitigated some of the effects of how international political developments surrounding the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War were vested with international legal validity. It identifies ambiguities associated with both moral and political conceptions of international minority rights, and advances an alternative account of their normative significance in international law. On this account, international minority rights speaks to wrongs that international law produces when it reallocates international legal authority to rule people and territory from some sovereign legal actors to others. So, much like last week, our objective here is to understand how minority rights are kind of like a stopgap measure, designed to mitigate the adverse consequences of the distribution of sovereignty. Okay, and that's pretty much it. Reach out to me if you haven't already to discuss the final paper. Otherwise, I'll see you on the discussion forum. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.